speaking of cyber luminaries, though, it is my honor to introduce to you Alex Stamos, who is director of the Stanford Internet Observatory. And prior to that, he worked at Facebook as the chief security officer. And prior to that, he was at Yahoo. I actually met him several years before that. And the whole time he has really engaged me on kind of whatever the next issue is going to be, and really learned so much from the things that the way that he looks at the world. And I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to talk to us about today as well. Alex, how you doing?
I'm doing okay. Nothing going on these days. So I feel like your event wasn't very timely, Ari.
We try our best.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you for having me. And the event's been great so far. Really appreciate everybody's talk so far. That last panel was great. I thought the keynotes were all really interesting. And I'm really excited to be able to close it out. Great. So I've seen actually there's been a surprising lack of slide decks in this event so far. So I'm gonna try to I'm gonna channel my inner fake professor and ruin that record so far. What I want to do is talk a little bit about some of the things that we've learned over the last couple of weeks from the election. And I thought I'd give a quick overview of some of the things that went well, didn't go well, and some of the lessons that this has for the incoming administration and the new Congress of issues that are going to have to be addressed. So I don't have a ton of time, so we'll do this pretty quickly. Talk about what work we did in some of these challenges. So the things that obviously went well. So first off, there was a very few technical faults, either faults in systems that were organic and caused by those systems failing. And we have at this point a lack of any evidence of faults that were generated by any adversarial action. This is incredible and not what was expected by lots of people coming out of 2016 in the information we learned about how a number of US adversaries had probed into election networks during that time. The fact that the systems did not fall down and that if there were attempts, they weren't that successful is a fantastic outcome. There were examples of foreign interference, most notably by some Iranian actors, with some disinformation that turned out to be a little bit amateurish. We have found some other stuff that we'll talk about that is a little bit of foreign groups dipping their toes into the disinformation space. But for the most part, I can't think of actually one example of any foreign influence operation that you could call at all effective. That doesn't mean there wasn't disinformation, as we'll get to, but the foreign component of it was pretty small. And I think a bunch of these, the big kind of meta thing that went really well is there was incredibly successful coordination between the private sector, local and state governments, and the federal government. And I have to give a lot of credit here to the very hardworking people at CISA, including Director Chris Krebs, who, as we all know, was fired by tweet yesterday for telling the truth about the election security issues and the lack of impact on the outcome, but also Matt Masterson, who led up a lot of this work, Brian Scully, Matt Travis, Jeanette Manfra, who helped set up a lot of the structures in NPPD that came here, and then hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of really dedicated civil servants that worked incredibly hard at CISA to provide services to local and state officials, to run red team exercises, tabletop exercises, to build technical frameworks that they could offer to people, and to very calmly and professionally handle the disinformation environment. And so, this was not an accident that this election went reasonably well. This is due to some very hard work that existed over years and years. And I got to see some of this start in the run-up to the 2018 midterms, which turned out to be a pretty good dry run of the kinds of coordination we needed. But honestly, this is an area that turned out much better than I personally expected. One of the other things that we had coming into this election was a little bit more of what the 9/11 Commission called institutionalized imagination. It's actually one of if we had the equivalent of a 9/11 Commission report for the 2016 election, one of the things that I expect would be pointed out is that there was a lack of cooperation between the public and private sectors and of thinking forward on the kinds of things our adversaries could do outside of the traditional kinds of cyber attacks that everybody was potentially expecting. And this lack of institutionalized imagination in the 9/11 context existed within the US government and between agencies involved in protecting the United States. In 2016 existed between the public and private sectors, makes it a little bit different. And finally, this cycle, we had that imagination built into multiple levels. We had obviously the people working at CISA. We had a countering foreign influence task force that had the FBI, NSA Cyber Command, the Election Assistance Commission, a bunch of different components of the federal government, and then groups at the large tech companies who were both helping defend networks, but then also work on the disinformation problem. And then obviously the local and state election officials for whom this kind of thinking was not something that was on their radar before 2016, and who had to make a pretty significant change in how they thought about who their technical adversaries were, the quality of those adversaries, and what their possible goals would be. And so this kind of, no one person or group was in charge of creating this imagination across multiple different agencies, but the fact that it existed this time, I think, is one of the significant differences that we had. Related to that is there was a significant public-private partnership in the run-up to the election. I think this is underplayed. There have been dozens and dozens of takedowns of foreign influence operations on the large platforms over the last 2 years. And a significant portion of those are related to the work that is being done in the public sector to understand these adversaries and to pass both TTPs as well as more detailed technical information to the companies that then have the ability to take one technical hint and turn it into an exploration of the entire disinformation space. The most prominent example of this would be the takedown of the Peace Data website and the associated accounts and personas that were wrapped around it. Peace Data was a front from what used to be called the Internet Research Agency, what we can call kind of the Prigozhin universe of disinformation actors. And it was aimed at mostly people on the left, kind of a mostly anti-war, anti-imperialism, and contained a lot of stories that it turns out in this case were not written by Prigozhin employees in St. Petersburg this time, but were written by actual Americans who did not know that the people they were talking to were fake personas, that their editors and the folks who were paying them were actually working for a Russian disinformation group. This takedown of Peace Data, while probably not hugely impactful on the election, is a great example of what can happen if you have this kind of public and private partnership that did not exist in the run-up to 2016. And then we've had lots of rapid and coordinated transparency from the various government agencies who do this. I got to give a lot of credit to Ann Neuberger and her new cybersecurity director at NSA for breaching kind of the famous shield of obscurity around that agency by publishing detailed documents going into the mechanisms by which American adversaries are breaking into systems, how their malware works, and what their overall TTPs are. That is incredibly useful for real defenders to know what is actually going on in the real world. The other group that's obviously been really good on transparency is CISA themselves, with CISA.gov/rumor control being one of the most important websites during the election period of having clear, plain English explanations of why certain rumors about the election are false. These were incredibly useful for us in our work to be able to reference back to authoritative sources and to push people to it. I think this is a fantastic example, and I'd love to see both of these kinds of efforts continue even outside the election period. So let's talk just briefly about kind of what we saw, though, from a disinformation environment. To give you a quick background of why we have this information, I was part of standing up this thing called the Election Integrity Partnership. This was a collaboration of 4 different institutions. So my team at the Stanford Internet Observatory, the University of Washington's Center for an Informed Public, which is under Dr. Kate Starboard, Graphica, which is a private company in New York that does social media analytics, and the Atlantic Council's DFR lab. All 4 of these institutions have done a lot of work on disinformation in the past. And the reason we stood up this partnership specifically for the election came out of the fact that I was lucky enough to be able to send 4 of my students to go work at CISA on election security this summer. And 3 of those students kind of went heads down on the technical side. They worked on scanning frameworks and such, and worked side by side with CISA's staff on finding technical vulnerabilities in infrastructure. One of them was focused on the disinformation side. And one of the things that she found in talking to the folks at CISA is that while CISA and other government agencies had a pretty clear mandate to handle foreign interference, especially that is technical, and the part of disinformation that you could definitely attribute back to a foreign actor, domestic disinformation was something that for which there was a massive hole of both authorizations, but also people having the right skill set to track and deal with domestic disinformation. One of the problems with disinformation is you really don't know who is behind it until a decent amount of time afterwards. And so having as a threshold question something being foreign is a very difficult place for a government agency to be in, because it just makes it very difficult to do kind of the initial study of the themes, the messages, the content that is being pushed out, since it is the determination or the attribution of who's behind that could take weeks or months. And so there's clearly an opportunity here for us to help out. So we put this partnership together with the goal of, instead of these 4 institutions writing these big detailed reports after the fact, 3 or 4 months after the election, of this is all the horrible things that happened, to try to operationalize our research, to team up with CISA and the local and state election officials via the Election Integrity ISAC, and to provide an operational study of disinformation in real time to try to mitigate the impact. We don't have to go into this in detail, but this is effectively the flowchart of how that worked. We had government stakeholders, again, mostly through the Election Integrity ISAC, which were great partners of ours, press partners, civil society, so a number of different groups who care about voting rights and such. And then we plugged into the major social media platforms. One of the benefits of the work we did is we plugged in at these platforms at the operational and investigation level, not at the political level, which is one of the lessons that I have taken from this and from my work in industry. Is the closer you're able to get to the people who are hands on keyboard of doing the investigation and then mitigating these kinds of attacks, the more likely it is you're able to get a decision that is based only upon the policies these companies have and not upon broader political concerns, which is critical if you want these decisions to happen very quickly. Now, our overall scope here was very limited, right? This was election-related disinformation. So we did not look at all at disinformation about the candidates, of them saying things about each other or the general political sphere, just about the election itself. There's about 120 people from these 4 institutions. About half of those people came from Stanford. We hired 30 new students to help work our what we called our tier 1. And then we worked in shifts during the day. We had at the end 5 4-hour shifts. So 20 hours a day, we had coverage. We were taking tips from the outside, but then also using software we had built internally and data access agreements that we had created to go look for election disinformation. About 90% of the stuff actually was found internally, not from the outside, but we were happy to get those tips from the outside as well. That would go to this first tier, who would archive those examples for later study, pull down the metadata, would make a determination of whether it's in scope or not. And then if it was in scope, that would go to a second tier of analysts who had more experience. Instead of students, these were mostly professionals who had done this for a while. And those folks would determine, how are we going to handle this? Kind of the median thing we do, if we knew this was election disinformation, if we had a factual basis we could point to demonstrate that, and we believed it was in violation of platform policies, is we then immediately send that to the platforms. And then if we saw that this was a theme or something that was really interesting that we thought would merit public communication, that would be sent to another group that would write that up. And then we would put that on our Twitter account, as well as a live blog that we were running on election day and the days afterwards. So we started this process by looking at the policies of the major platforms. We started this in August, and between August and then just days before the election, we updated our analysis 8 times, because it turns out that the most effective way, if you want to get policy changes from the company, is not to make kind of a general statement of this content is garbage, I don't like, this person should be taken off. It's to make very specific asks of their policies based upon realistic scenarios that are not partisan and not tied to specific actors. And so that's what we tried to do. We came up and we measured all these folks against each other. And the first version of this, most of the boxes said non-comprehensive or none, right? That the vast majority of the policies were not that good. And then by testing them against the scenarios that we thought were realistic and putting kind of targeted pressure on them, we were able to see changes over that period of time. This was the final version of going into the election of what the policies were from these platforms. One of the challenges here is it turns out not all these policies are written down in one place. We actually have the big detailed PDF that we reference of how do we make these determinations? And in that, we have to cite individual tweets from executives, blog posts, news stories. And so that's kind of a meta issue, is that there's a lot of opacity still from these platforms of what their policies are and how they're going to enforce them. We started our operations in September. By the time of the election, right before the election, it was pretty clear the kind of narratives that were going to be pushed. And so we were able to publish this grid of what we expected on election day and in the post-election period. I think it actually turned out pretty darn well. Our predictions were really good here. The team that did this did a really good job of trying to figure out what that was. It was clear that the blue shift, that the vote by mail, and the fact that counting was quite likely to take a while, was going to open a door for a number of false narratives that might be based upon one specific factual incident or based upon a completely invented incident. There was some foreign interference here. So, there's a couple of narratives during the conversation that we can trace back to foreign sources, but they're kind of the exception that proves a rule. One of those exceptions of something that came from a foreign source is this idea of a color revolution. So it turns out the idea that the United States is going to have a color revolution is something that was first injected into the information environment by Russian state media, by specifically RT, which ran stories over and over again, starting in late 2019, about the idea that the deep state was going to conspire against Donald Trump, and that a color revolution was going to happen. Now, to those of us in the US, the term color revolution is often seen in a positive narrative, right? That a color revolution is a revolution against a dictator in a post-Soviet state. But for Russia today, part of the goal here was to try to brand color revolutions as the actions of specifically the CIA and other kinds of deep state conspirators. And so this was injected and pushed by RT starting in 2019. And then picked up in 2020 by what you might call kind of conservative influencers, and then went mainstream when one of those influencers showed up on Tucker Carlson. As we normally see in these cases, if something makes it to Fox News primetime, then it goes massively wide. And after this Russian idea made it onto Fox News, it went pretty big, eventually ending up actually in a Q drop, which is where a lot of these conspiracy theories eventually end up. But again, most of these narratives did not come this way. We just kind of documented this because it was an interesting way, and one of the few actual successes, it seems, of Russian overt media to inject their narratives into the U.S. discussion. Most of the vast majority of disinformation we saw, though, came from verified domestic influencers. There's a number of different claims about the election that people would use terms like it's going viral, but they're not truly viral, right? Actually, these are things that are being pushed by people with very large amounts of followers. And if you look at the engagement stats, it turns out that those folks are the biggest issue and that there's no punishment for them. When you look at our cases, what we find is that the same accounts over and over and over again are pressing disinformation. And while they might get one tweet or post or video labeled, they're never punished for the fact that they're always completely wrong. And this is a significant policy issue for the companies and perhaps even for the incoming administration. Okay, so what are some of these challenges that came out of this we have to address? So the first question is, while there was unprecedented coordination here, there's still kind of a question of, when you come from private industry, of who in the government is your partner on any given part of the security lifecycle. The NCKIC was one of the was the fusion center that was stood up to perhaps handle some of these issues. But the truth is that the vast majority of responsive work is still done by the FBI, partially because the FBI is a franchise. They are in every city. And if you give them a call because you have a security issue, they will be in your office in 10 minutes, or I'm sorry, a couple hours. And that is something that as a CISO, you really appreciate. But we still don't have that kind of on-the-spot, in-person support for critical companies coming from the rest of the government. And I think this is one of the things that now, under the new administration, hopefully with a functional interagency process and the like, that needs to be thought about is who owns different parts of this pipeline. It was great to see that everybody work together on election security, but obviously there's a lot more than elections that we have to be worrying about. Another interesting question this raises is who is responsible for ongoing disinformation response in the US government? In the election context, CISA had a clear responsibility for coordinating around election security because election systems are critical infrastructure. And even if there are some limits on their ability to handle disinformation, they still had kind of the big picture that they were responsible for. The number one topic for both foreign and domestic disinformation in 2021 is probably going to be the vaccines, the COVID vaccines that will be coming out. There's already a massive culture of people who are questioning a vaccine safety that is domestic and comes from a variety of different sources. That those are groups that cut across normal political and demographic lines. So it's a very kind of complicated information space. But we also, the COVID vaccines are a point of national pride for countries who are teaming up with their own pharmaceutical companies to support this, and a point of national security. And who is responsible for vaccine disinformation in the US government right now is a really interesting question. And I don't think there's a good answer for it. And this is the kind of thing for which we're going to want to have an answer, that whenever you have an event of national importance outside of an election for which disinformation activity is going to be incredibly aggressive and could actually affect the lives of real citizens, we're going to need somebody in charge. For the tech companies, they're going to need to be more subtle about some of their responses and then more aggressive in other ways. I could do a whole talk on this. In fact, I have a whole talk on this. But I think one of the core things is that the parts of the platform that provide the most amplification are going to need much more aggressive responses. That includes people who have the ability to get live streams. Some of these live streamers on YouTube have audiences the same size as daytime CNN, right? So in those situations, a YouTube or a Facebook Live is effectively operating as a cable news channel. And the editorial responsibility should be higher there, not lower. And unfortunately, the big influencers are being treated with kid gloves right now. And that has created a lot of the disinformation environment because they're only motivated to spread disinformation. There's no penalty if it ever turns out that they're wrong. And then other issues that obviously we got to be thinking about in the big picture is kind of the long-term competitive advantage issues. We are, still, TikTok just filed a legal filing of asking the administration of whether or not they're still in trouble. But I think something that has been appreciated during the TikTok argument is that the same exact argument is happening in Europe, except the United States is playing the part of China in that situation of whether or not American companies are allowed to be competitive in Europe. I think we're going to need to have like a really strong focus on bearing the small differences between the United States and Europe on these issues and coming up with a consistent set of data protection policies that our citizens can live under and that preferably does not allow Chinese companies to operate with impunity and to transfer the data of both American and European citizens into the PRC. This is going to be a huge challenge, but it's the kind of thing that I'm hopeful under a new administration can actually be done with the power of our allies. And I think like the critical thing, it is fantastic that things worked out well for the election. We have to have the same level of engagement and interest and effort around the long tail of critical companies in this country. And the number one people that need help right now is the healthcare sector. Healthcare sector is getting absolutely ravaged by ransomware right now. And these critical companies that do not have the kinds of large security teams that you expect out of the oil and gas industry, the financial industry, out of big tech, are not able to consume a lot of the output of government agencies and can't get kind of the benefits that you get if you're a large company with your own threat intelligence team, the ability to work with some of your partners in the FBI, NSA, and the like. We have to look at the small to medium enterprise. And I think we have to start in the healthcare space because this is having a real impact. And for us to have like a healthcare security crisis in the middle of a pandemic is really unfortunate timing. And it's where we have to absolutely focus now that the election is over. Anyway, I'm sorry I don't have a lot of time to chat about this, but if you have any more questions or thoughts, please hit me up on my Stanford account. Anyway, happy to take your questions.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. That was great, and there's nothing on the back end of this, so we can keep going as long as you're willing to stay for, as far as
yeah, absolutely
concerned there. We got two questions to ask, and people can use the Q&A to ask more if they want to. So one of them isn't so much a question as sort of a statement, but I'm going to turn it into more of a question. So this is from Jamila Jones-Fleet, who says, I wish it were possible to keep the politics out of these tech talks, just tech talk, less finger pointing and blame laying. And I guess the question is, how can we move to a point, especially talking about something like election security, where we can, make it less political in that way? And what's your kind of view on that?
Yes. I wish that election security was not political. Unfortunately, my talk is not the thing that has created that politicization. The president of the United States fired his head of cybersecurity for the election for telling the truth. And so I don't think there's anything else I can say about that other than Krebs and his team did an incredibly good job. And the thanks that they got was they got pushed out the door by a tweet. And it wasn't just Chris. Chris is fantastic and has done a fantastic job. He had a whole team here, all of whom are now looking for jobs. And I think that is a really bad way to treat public servants, people who could be doing lots of other things and making honestly a lot more money, who decided that they were going to work on election security. I also think it's a really bad signal to send that these critical functions like cybersecurity, which really should be apolitical, are going to be politicized. So I hope under the next administration that you see people who are allowed to do their job, even if the findings that they have around election security and other critical cybersecurity incidents have a political impact, that their expertise will be rewarded and respected, and that they won't be pressured to change the things they say based upon political pressure from the White House.
Yeah, let me take that part of it to another question I wanted to ask myself of you, which is, thinking about that and what the challenge that the next administration has, and the fact that you talked about Ann Newberger, who we had yesterday, and was really great, and you talked about Chris. And we had Grant Schneider before, right, who's gone. But we've had some really great people that have done public service, some that are still in public service, but there are a lot of open jobs in the cybersecurity leadership space in government right now. Some of them are political jobs and some of them are career jobs. How do you see the Biden administration filling those jobs, and who should they be looking for?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one of my kind of long concerns about talent in the government from a security perspective is that there seems to be a unbalance where there's a huge amount of really good technical talent ends up on the offensive side, because the folks at NSA and Cyber Command have done a really good job of building pipelines, internship programs, scholarships, and then going out into the security community and demonstrating why these jobs are important, and honestly selling the kind of technical sexiness of some of the work they do. And so that's great. I want those agencies as a taxpayer to be extremely well staffed, but we haven't seen the same kind of movement, both from new grads and then also of professionals into the defensive side as much. And I think that's one of the things I'd like to see from the Biden administration at all levels, is to really try to tap the existing cybersecurity workforce and then make it easy for people to come in, even if it's only for a year or two. I think the kinds of programs that we saw under the Obama administration were great. A lot of them, the US DS, 18F and such, but a lot of those were kind of general technical jobs. They were not specifically around cyber. They were not targeted specifically at people with information security experience. So I'd love to see either of those programs expanded or equivalent programs to be created that would bring a lot more of that talent into government. And I'd like to see practitioners, right? Like, I think there should be a good mix of people who have focused on policy and on the operation of DC, and the people who have had to have responsibility themselves. And I'd love to see a mix of practitioners and policy folks in the cyber side. Just like I hope what's happening in DC is there starts to be a recognition that doing information security is actually a profession, right? And it would be great if we move into a place like you have with the FDA or the CDC, where you have policy folks next to MDs, right? It would be nice to see more of a balance like that.
Yeah. Here's a question from David Hoffman. How do we know that covert foreign operations were not successful in 2020? And how do we know that algorithms are not being manipulated to inflame the count the vote and stop the steal polarizations on both sides?
Right. So we don't know for sure, but what we can tell is, those are two of the themes. So if I'm giving a little bit of a preview. The 120 people that worked on this were currently cleaning up our data. So we have around 1,000 tickets in our database, tens of thousands of pieces of content. So we're going through, labeling them, pulling the metadata, and then we will be writing up a report that will come out in January with, I think, hopefully what is the probably the strongest empirical take on what happened on social media from a disinformation perspective. But right now, those are two of the themes where we're looking at. And you saw that graph I had with the curve in each of those boxes. I didn't really have time to dive into it. But we were watching very closely when these themes started getting pushed. And it is very clear that unlike in some other incidents, that the absolute biggest drivers of engagement around these themes were the large influencers, the people with blue check marks who we know exactly who they are, and we know they're Americans, that they had a massive outsized impact compared to this content going viral on its own. And so it is quite likely that it will turn out that there was some foreign bots, foreign accounts doing some amplification. But if you just look at how effective the large influencer accounts were, there's not a lot of room for them to have done that work. And so I think it's highly likely by the time we're done with our empirical study that our outcome will be that the vast majority of amplification happened by Americans of whom we know exactly who they are.
Okay, that's interesting. I guess the question is, you talked a little bit about next steps, but where do you see the work going, into the next election, into 2022, and how are you guys going to keep what you have going and keep that influence?
Well, so I think on the disinformation side, what I'd like to see is some of the lessons learned around the election to be turned into a broader capability that can work on multiple problems at once, right? Like elections are important, clearly, but they're not the only thing that's important. And like I said, I think the other thing I would focus on would be the COVID vaccine, that we need to be looking specifically, before we were doing election work this year, we were really focused on foreign influence operations around COVID. And the combination of the protests in Hong Kong and COVID have kind of gone the People's Republic off of the bench when it comes to disinformation. So we've seen kind of a huge growth in English language disinformation capabilities from the Chinese, driven from those two topics. And there's no good evidence the Chinese were at all involved in the US election, but it is highly likely they will get involved again on COVID and vaccine security. And so I think it would be great to build some kind of capability in the government that can handle these things, no matter what the underlying issue is. Because I don't think, again, we had CISA having responsibility around the election here, but I don't think it's realistic for us to have the CDC to have a counter disinformation team, the FDA to have a counter disinformation team, right? Like we're not going to be able to build a model where every single agency, if they are handling an issue of national import for which there's foreign influence, that they're able to handle it themselves. And so that's what I'd like to see is the creation of a function that will be active during 2022 and 2024, but is not only around election security.
Let me go try to pull that into this one last question we received. This is from Timble, and it says that basically, I guess the question is sort of tied into those things about how do we go about protecting, he says, election staff on their personal accounts, but I guess that goes further to your point about COVID too. Now that we have so many more people working from home, you're talking about disaggregating the campaigns, everything's already disaggregated. And in a lot of the work that you're talking about in medical world, it's going to be disaggregated. How do you go about protecting the people that we need to protect on their personal accounts, the election staff and leaders and other ways?
That's a great question. And there's a real issue here, which is the personal is political now, right? That for a large band of people, the personal Gmail accounts, Facebook accounts, Instagram accounts, TikTok accounts of these people are effectively, to a certain extent, national security assets, right? And that's kind of a problem we've never really dealt with before. That attacking the home network of Dr. Fauci is the kind of thing that you would possibly see a memo about, in the general staff of a peer military. I think what we're going to have to do is, again, we're going to have to build kind of a generalized solution here that's not just about the election, and this is probably CISA because it is a purely defensive, but with their partnership in the FBI and NSA, that there is much more support given to people who are in these critical roles. First, from an educational perspective of, okay, you're a local election official, these are the things you should do around your security, but then also partnership with the big tech companies. Like the flip side of the discussion of the power of the big platforms is that if you if you're able to work with 6 or 7 companies, you're able to cover 80 or 90% of the personal risk for these folks, right? At least when it comes to cloud services. And so I'd like to, there have been, starting honestly in 2016, we did some of this work at Facebook and it's gotten much bigger about reaching out and trying to identify people who might be targeted. It would be great to see a systemic program that was run out of the government of these are people who are high risk around this area, and say it is vaccine production, say it is around COVID response or around the election or around whatever crisis our country is going to face next, that they get education, they get contacted, they have an escalation path. This is the problem for most people is you can't call 911 and say, I think my Google account was hacked. That they have an escalation path where things are handled properly, and that there's proactive partnership between the government and the companies to proactively lock down these accounts and to turn up monitoring in case there are some attacks. And there's some success here. This is Microsoft especially has done a really good job of going out and figuring out who are the local election officials, who are the candidates and such. And that's why we keep on getting these good reports from them of we saw and stopped 7 attempted intrusions by APT28 into these accounts, for example. It'd just be great to see that like a broader program and for all of that statistical data be coming back through one place so that we can, as citizens, see kind of a dashboard of what the activity looks like against the personal but critical accounts.
Yeah, I know Google has done the multi-factor authentication piece too. It's really gotten that out there too. I think authentication really is key in this for a lot of this as well. So it's not the only thing, but certainly.
Yeah, it's the easy thing, right? I mean, the number one way people's accounts get taken over is the reuse of passwords, right? That's just, nothing else is even close.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it. Thanks for closing this out. And I'd like to also thank our partners, Cyber Threat Alliance, Michael Daniel and his team, Bree Law, who helped put everything together and really helped to run the show here and get things moving. The Insight PR folks who helped us quite a bit and helped us find Dustin Loop and his team who ran the helped to produce this. There is going to be a YouTube. There's a YouTube from yesterday up now. There's going to be one up in a few minutes once this thing renders. Everything renders here that you can pull things down and take a look again. Please feel free to write us if you have any follow-up or any questions, everyone. And thanks again. And we'll be doing it next year. And thanks a lot for coming.